The whispers about the new schoolteacher had reached every corner of Kelton, Utah, before she'd even stepped off the train. Wilhelmina Dawson clutched her carpetbag tightly as she descended onto the platform, her eyes taking in the dusty main street that would be her home for the foreseeable future. The year was 1885, and the promise of a teaching position in this growing railroad town had pulled her all the way from Boston with dreams of independence and purpose. "You must be Miss Dawson," a stern-faced woman approached, her gaze appraising Wilhelmina from head to toe. "I'm Mrs. Fletcher, head of the school board. We've been expecting you." "Yes, pleased to meet you," Wilhelmina replied, her voice carrying the refined tones of her New England upbringing with traces of the Irish lilt she'd inherited from her mother. Mrs. Fletcher's eyebrows rose slightly. "Well, you certainly didn't mention your manner of speaking in your correspondence." Wilhelmina felt her cheeks warm. "My accent, I suppose I didn't think it relevant to my qualifications." "We shall see about that," Mrs. Fletcher said with a tight smile. "The children start Monday. I do hope they'll be able to understand their lessons." The cutting remark stung, but Wilhelmina straightened her back. She'd faced worse in Boston's competitive teaching circles. "I assure you, Mrs. Fletcher, my students will have no trouble understanding me." The boarding house where Wilhelmina was to stay sat at the edge of town, a modest two-story building run by a widow named Mrs. Palmer. The older woman welcomed her warmly enough, though her expression changed when Wilhelmina spoke. "My stars, you're certainly not from around these parts, Mrs. Palmer commented as she showed Wilhelmina to her room. "The children will have quite a time with that fancy way of talking." "I'm sure we'll adjust to one another," Wilhelmina replied diplomatically, though doubt had begun to gnaw at her confidence. Sunday morning found Wilhelmina at the town's only church, where she hoped to make a good impression before school began. She wore her best dress, a modest blue calico with a high collar, and pinned her dark blonde hair into a neat bun. As she entered, conversations hushed momentarily before resuming with greater intensity. After the service, Reverend Thomas introduced her to the congregation. "Please welcome Miss Dawson, our new schoolteacher." "Thank you for the warm welcome," Wilhelmina said. "I look forward to meeting all your children tomorrow." A titter ran through the crowd at her accent, and Wilhelmina saw several mothers exchange glances. One man whispered loudly enough for her to hear, "Hope she teaches better than she talks." Mortified, Wilhelmina excused herself and hurried back to the boarding house, wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake in coming to Kelton. Monday morning arrived with clear skies and Wilhelmina's determination renewed. The schoolhouse was a simple one-room building with rows of desks facing a blackboard. She had arrived early to prepare, writing her name neatly across the board, Miss Wilhelmina Dawson. The children filed in, aged from 6 to 16, eyeing her with the frank curiosity of youth. Their parents lingered at the doorway, watching with varying degrees of skepticism. "Good morning, class," she began. "I am Miss Dawson, and I will be your teacher this year." Immediately, several of the older boys started mimicking her accent, exaggerating her pronunciation to the amusement of their classmates. Wilhelmina felt her face grow hot but maintained her composure. "That will be quite enough," she said firmly. "In this classroom, we shall respect one another, differences and all." One particularly bold boy of about 14 raised his hand. "Miss Dawson, are you going to teach us to talk like fancy Boston folk?" More laughter erupted. A small girl in the front row called out, "My pa says no one can understand a word you're saying." Wilhelmina saw several parents at the door nodding in agreement, their expressions ranging from amusement to open disdain. Her heart sank, but years of teaching had taught her that showing weakness would only make matters worse. "I am here to teach you reading, writing, arithmetic, history, and science," she replied evenly. "How I speak is simply part of who I am, just as your ways of speaking are part of who you are." "Now, shall we begin with the roll call?" The rest of the day was a struggle. Every time she spoke, there were suppressed giggles and poor imitations of her accent. By afternoon dismissal, Wilhelmina's confidence was badly shaken. As the children rushed out, she sank into her chair, wondering how she would endure weeks, let alone months, of such treatment. She was gathering her belongings when a deep voice from the doorway startled her. "Don't let them get to you, Miss Dawson. Folks around here just ain't used to different." Wilhelmina looked up to find a tall man leaning against the doorframe. His face was tanned from the sun, with laugh lines around eyes as blue as the Utah sky. He wore a worn Stetson, dusty boots, and had the lean, muscled build of someone who spent his days on horseback. "I beg your pardon." She managed, embarrassed to be caught in a moment of weakness. He stepped into the classroom, removing his hat. "Yates Blackburn," he introduced himself with a slight bow. "I ranch about 5 miles outside town, brought my sister's boy to school today since she's laid up with the fever." "Oh," Wilhelmina said, noticing the young boy hovering behind Mr. Blackburn. "You must be Timothy. I marked you absent today." "He was just shy, miss," Yates explained, giving the boy a gentle push forward. "Got here late and didn't want to come in when he heard the others laughing." Wilhelmina knelt to the boy's level. "Hello, Timothy, I'm Miss Dawson. I hope you'll join us tomorrow morning." The boy nodded, his eyes wide as he listened to her speak. "You talk pretty," he said suddenly, causing his uncle to chuckle. "See there," Yates said, his eyes meeting Wilhelmina's. "Not everyone in Kelton's got rocks between their ears. Some of us can appreciate a voice that sounds like music." Wilhelmina felt her cheeks flush for an entirely different reason now. "That's very kind of you, Mr. Blackburn." "Yates, please," he insisted, and I meant it. "Don't let the townsfolk scare you off. They'll come around once they see what their children are learning." After they left, Wilhelmina found herself smiling for the first time that day. Perhaps there was hope for her in Kelton after all. The following days brought more of the same challenges. During her second week, Mrs. Fletcher made an unannounced visit to observe her teaching. Wilhelmina was explaining the history of the Louisiana Purchase when a boy in the back row began a particularly cruel imitation of her accent. Several children laughed, and Mrs. Fletcher's disapproving gaze fell heavily upon her. "Miss Dawson, a word after class, if you please," the woman said before departing. That afternoon, Mrs. Fletcher didn't mince words. "The parents are concerned, Miss Dawson. They worry their children can't understand your unusual manner of speaking, and your control of the classroom leaves much to be desired." "The children understand me perfectly well," Wilhelmina defended herself. "It's merely that they've been encouraged to mock rather than listen." "Perhaps, Mrs. Fletcher replied coolly, "but we hired you to teach, not to give the town something to gossip about. If things don't improve by the end of the month, we may need to reconsider your position." Wilhelmina walked back to her boarding house fighting tears. 1 month to prove herself or lose everything she'd worked for. She was so distracted she nearly collided with Yates Blackburn outside the general store. "Whoa there," he said, steadying her with a gentle hand on her arm. His smile faded when he saw her expression. "What's wrong, Miss Dawson?" Before she could stop herself, Wilhelmina found herself telling him about Mrs. Fletcher's ultimatum. "I don't know what more I can do. The children are learning, but all anyone seems to notice is how I speak." Yates frowned. "That's not right. You're the best teacher this town's ever had, accent or no." "How would you know?" she asked, surprised. "Timothy can't stop talking about what he's learning, and I've been asking around. The kids are picking things up faster than they ever did with old Mr. Jenkins, who could barely stay awake through his own lessons." His defense warmed her heart, but reality remained harsh. "Unfortunately, Mrs. Fletcher doesn't seem to share your assessment." Yates looked thoughtful. "What if we showed the town what these kids are really learning? Some kind of demonstration that proves your teaching is working. Accent be damned, pardon my language, miss." The idea took root immediately. "A recitation," Wilhelmina said, excitement building. "We could hold an evening where the students demonstrate their knowledge. Poems, arithmetic, history facts, everything they've learned so far. That's the spirit." Yates grinned, his eyes crinkling at the corners. and I'll spread the word, make sure every parent in town attends." "Why are you helping me, Mr. Blackburn?" Wilhelmina asked, suddenly curious about this cowboy who had become her unexpected champion. His expression softened. "Because every time you speak, it's like hearing a song I didn't know I'd been missing." He looked away, suddenly self-conscious. "Besides, Timothy needs a proper education, and you're giving him that." Wilhelmina felt a flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with her teaching worries. "Thank you," she said softly. "That means more than you know." For the next 2 weeks, Wilhelmina worked tirelessly with her students, preparing them for the recitation evening. To her surprise, as the children became invested in their presentations, the mocking of her accent diminished. She discovered that Timothy had a remarkable memory for poetry, and even the troublemakers found subjects that engaged them when given the chance to shine. The night of the recitation arrived, and the schoolhouse was packed with curious parents and townspeople. Mrs. Fletcher sat in the front row, her expression skeptical. Wilhelmina wore her finest dress and fought to keep her voice steady as she welcomed everyone. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Tonight, your children would like to share what they have been learning these past weeks." A few snickers greeted her accent, but then Timothy stepped forward and recited Longfellow's Paul Revere's Ride without a single mistake. Next came demonstrations of complex arithmetic problems, a detailed explanation of the water cycle, and perfect recitations of state capitals. The audience's attitude shifted palpably as the evening progressed. Parents who had been skeptical now watched with pride as their children demonstrated knowledge far beyond what they'd expected. By the time the final student finished, the room erupted in genuine applause. Reverend Thomas stood up. "I think we owe Miss Dawson our gratitude. It's clear our children are thriving under her instruction." Mrs. Fletcher looked less convinced, but said nothing as parents approached Wilhelmina with congratulations and apologies for their previous judgments. Yates found her after most people had left. "You did it," he said, his smile wide and proud. "They can't ignore what they saw tonight." "I couldn't have done it without your suggestion," Wilhelmina admitted, "or your support." "About that," Yates said, suddenly looking nervous. "I was wondering if you might consider having dinner with me this Saturday, at the hotel restaurant, proper and chaperoned, of course." Wilhelmina's heart skipped. "I would like that very much, Mr. Blackburn." "Yates," he reminded her. "And for the record, your accent is still the sweetest sound I know." Saturday's dinner was the first of many. Over the following weeks, Yates courted Wilhelmina with a respectful determination that both thrilled and frightened her. They rode together on Sundays after church, his horse steady beneath her as he taught her the names of distant mountains. He brought her wildflowers picked from the range and listened intently when she spoke of her dreams. Gradually, Kelton came to accept Wilhelmina. Her success with the students couldn't be denied, and her recitation evening had won over most of the skeptics. Even Mrs. Fletcher grudgingly admitted that the children were making excellent progress. One evening in late spring, Yates took Wilhelmina to his ranch for the first time, properly chaperoned by Mrs. Palmer. The modest homestead sat nestled against rolling hills, with a barn, corral, and a small but sturdy house built of local timber. "It's not much," he said, watching her face anxiously, "but the land's good, been adding to it every year." "It's beautiful," Wilhelmina replied honestly, taking in the wildflowers dotting the meadow and the clear stream running near the house. Over a simple dinner cooked by his housekeeper, Mrs. Hernandez, Yates told her about his dreams for the ranch. "I want to build something that lasts," he explained, "something to pass down someday." The implication hung in the air between them, unspoken but clear. Summer brought new challenges. A drought descended on the region, making everyone in and around Kelton anxious. Yates worked tirelessly to keep his cattle watered, often riding out before dawn and returning long after dark. Wilhelmina worried about him pushing himself too hard, though she admired his dedication. The school term ended with another successful recitation evening, this time with every seat filled, and not a single snicker when Wilhelmina spoke. As she prepared to close the schoolhouse for summer, Mrs. Fletcher made a rare appearance with unexpected news. "The school board has voted to offer you a permanent position, Miss Dawson," she announced. "Your results speak for themselves regardless of other matters." Wilhelmina could hardly believe it. "Thank you, Mrs. Fletcher, I accept with pleasure." Later, when she told Yates the news, his reaction surprised her. Instead of immediate congratulations, he grew quiet, his expression troubled. "Yates, what's wrong?" He took her hands in his. "Nothing's wrong, it's wonderful news, truly." He hesitated. "It's just that I'd been planning to ask you something, and now I'm not sure of the timing." Wilhelmina's heart quickened. "Ask me what?" Yates looked into her eyes. "Wilhelmina Dawson, I've loved you since I first heard your voice in that schoolroom. I love your kindness, your determination, and yes, that accent that sounds like home to me now. Would you do me the great honor of becoming my wife?" Joy washed over her, but doubt followed quickly. "The school board just offered me permanence. I've worked so hard for this position." "I know," Yates said earnestly. "And I would never ask you to give it up. The ranch is only 5 miles out. You could still teach if that's what you want." "A married teacher?" Wilhelmina asked, surprised. It was common practice for female teachers to resign upon marriage. Why not? Yates shrugged. "This is the West. We make our own rules sometimes, and if the board objects, well, I reckon the parents would have something to say about losing the best teacher Kelton's ever seen." Overwhelmed by his understanding, Wilhelmina threw her arms around him. "Yes, Yates Blackburn. Yes, I will marry you." Their wedding took place in August, a simple ceremony in Kelton's small church. To Wilhelmina's amazement, nearly the entire town attended, including all her students and even Mrs. Fletcher. Timothy served as ring-bearer, beaming with pride at his uncle's happiness. When Reverend Thomas pronounced them husband and wife, Yates kissed her with such tenderness that several of the women dabbed at their eyes. The reception that followed at the hotel was filled with food, music, and genuine warmth from people who had once mocked her. "Mrs. Blackburn," Yates whispered in her ear as they danced. "How does it sound?" "Wonderful," she replied, "no matter how I pronounce it." He laughed and spun her around the dance floor, heedless of the onlookers. "I love you, Wilhelmina, accent and all." Married life brought adjustments for both of them. Wilhelmina divided her time between the schoolhouse in town and their ranch home. Yates built her a small library where she could prepare her lessons, filling it with books ordered specially from Salt Lake City. She learned to cook Western-style meals under Mrs. Hernandez's patient tutelage, and discovered she had a talent for gardening in the challenging Utah soil. The school board had reluctantly agreed to let her continue teaching after her marriage, largely due to the parents' insistence. If anything, marriage had enhanced her standing in the community. The very accent that had once been mocked was now considered a charming quirk of their respected teacher. Winter came early that year, bringing heavy snows that isolated the ranch for days at a time. Wilhelmina found herself missing teaching during these periods, but treasured the quiet evenings with Yates by the fire, reading aloud or simply talking about their days. During one such snowbound evening, as wind howled outside their snug home, Wilhelmina shared news that would change everything. "Yates," she said, taking his hand, "I believe we will need to prepare a nursery by summer." His face transformed with wonder and joy as her meaning registered. "A baby, we're having a baby." She nodded, laughing as he whooped and lifted her gently, spinning her around the room before setting her carefully back on her feet. "Are you happy?" she asked, though his reaction had made it obvious. "Happy doesn't begin to cover it," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I can't wait to hear our child speak with your beautiful accent," Wilhelmina laughed. "They might take after you, you know." "Either way," he said, kissing her softly, "they'll be perfect." Spring brought renewal to the land and preparations at the ranch. Yates converted a small bedroom adjacent to theirs into a nursery, crafting a cradle from pine with his own hands. Wilhelmina sewed baby clothes in the evenings, her thoughts often turning to how she would balance motherhood with her teaching. The drought that had threatened the previous year returned with greater severity. Streams ran low, and the grass grew sparse on the range. Yates worked harder than ever, sometimes joining with neighboring ranchers to drive cattle to distant water sources. One evening, he returned home particularly exhausted, his face drawn with worry. "The north pasture's gone bone dry," he told her over dinner. "If rain doesn't come soon, we'll have to sell off some of the herd." Wilhelmina reached across the table to squeeze his hand. "We'll manage whatever comes," he smiled tiredly. "Having you believe in me makes all the difference." The community rallied as the drought worsened. Farmers and ranchers shared resources and labor, determined to weather the crisis together. Wilhelmina organized her students to help elderly neighbors maintain their vegetable gardens with precious saved water. The same people who had once judged her now sought her organizational skills and steady presence during hardship. "You've become the heart of this town," Yates told her proudly after a community meeting where she had presented a plan for water conservation. "Only because you gave me the courage to stay when I might have run," she replied. July brought both crisis and blessing. The drought reached its peak, with cattle suffering and crops failing throughout the region. But in the midst of this hardship, Wilhelmina went into labor one sweltering afternoon while Yates was checking the remaining water holes. Mrs. Hernandez sent Timothy riding for both the doctor and Yates. The boy found his uncle first, and Yates galloped home at breakneck speed, arriving just as Dr. Morrison was washing his hands. "Just in time, Blackburn," the doctor said. "Your wife's been asking for you." The next 12 hours were the longest of Yates's life as he held Wilhelmina's hand through her labor, wiping her brow and whispering encouragement. Just before dawn, their son entered the world with a lusty cry that seemed to echo through the ranch house. "Alexander James Blackburn," Wilhelmina whispered as she held their baby for the first time. They had agreed on the name months before, honoring both her father and his. "He's perfect," Yates said, his voice breaking as he gently touched his son's tiny fingers. "Just perfect." As if celebrating the new life, rain began to fall that very afternoon, gentle at first, then steady and soaking. It continued for 3 days, bringing relief to the parched land and renewed hope to Kelton and its surroundings. "A good omen, Mrs. Hernandez declared as she helped care for mother and baby. "This child brings blessings." Motherhood brought new challenges and joys for Wilhelmina. When school resumed in September, she brought Alexander with her, setting up a small cradle in the corner of the classroom. The children were enchanted by the baby, and many mothers who came to collect their children stopped to admire him and offer advice. "You've changed this town," Mrs. Palmer told her one afternoon as she visited the schoolhouse. "Not just with your teaching, but by showing us all how to accept differences." Wilhelmina smiled, watching as her students practiced their reading. "The town changed me too. It gave me a home and family I never expected to find." As Alexander grew from infant to toddler, Yates's prediction came true. The boy developed a unique way of speaking that blended his mother's refined Eastern accent with his father's Western drawl. The combination charmed everyone who heard it. "Just like his mama," Yates would say proudly whenever anyone commented on the boy's speech. "The sweetest sound in the world." 4 years after Alexander's birth, Wilhelmina gave birth to twin girls, Catherine and Elizabeth. The ranch prospered under Yates's careful management, and they built an extension to the house to accommodate their growing family. Wilhelmina continued teaching until the twins were born, then reluctantly resigned to focus on raising her children. But her influence on Kelton's education continued. She organized a lending library that grew into a permanent collection housed in the town hall, and she tutored children who needed extra help after school hours. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Yates surprised her with a trip to Boston to visit her family. It was Alexander's and the twins' first journey on a train, and they watched wide-eyed as the landscape changed from western mountains and deserts to eastern forests and finally the Atlantic coast. In Boston, Wilhelmina found herself speaking with a hint of Western inflection that amused her sisters. "You sound different," they teased. "Like a proper frontier woman now." "I suppose I am," she replied, watching Yates show their children the harbor ships, "and I wouldn't change a thing." When they returned to Kelton, the town seemed to have grown smaller somehow, yet more precious. Their ranch had expanded over the years, now employing several hands and producing not just cattle but also horses that Yates bred and trained. One evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the distant mountains gold, Alexander practicing his roping skills while the twins chased fireflies across the yard, Yates took her hand. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked quietly. "Coming west, staying even when they mocked you?" Marrying a simple rancher, Wilhelmina turned to him, this man whose face had weathered with years of sun and wind, whose hands were calloused from honest work, whose heart had never wavered in its devotion to her. "Never," she said firmly. "Not for a single moment. Every choice led me here to you and our children and this life we've built." He brought her hand to his lips. "Your voice still gets me, you know, still the sweetest sound I know, even after all these years," she teased. "Especially after all these years," he replied seriously. "Because now it's filled with the history of us." As darkness fell over the ranch, they called the children in for supper, their voices blending in the cool evening air, his western drawl, her eastern lilt, and their children's unique combination of both. To Wilhelmina, it was the sound of home, the sound of love that had overcome prejudice, the sound of a life far richer than anything she could have imagined when she first stepped off that train in Kelton all those years ago. And she knew, with absolute certainty, that the accent that had once made her an outsider had led her exactly where she belonged.